Chapter 1 of The Man Who Fought the Devil by Eva K. Betz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Therese. The Man Who Fought the Devil by Eva K. Betz. Chapter 1. Jean-Marie Vianney walked down the lane, a shepherd's crook in one hand, a little statue of the Madonna in the other. The sheep and the donkey he was driving pushed on instinctively toward a small valley where the lush land was fed from a cool stream. Jean-Marie liked the little place because of a hillock in the center of the field, a hillock which, as soon as he arrived, became an altar to Our Lady. A horseman clattered down the road. "Boy," he called to Jean-Marie, "have you some cool water you can give me?" "I'm sorry I don't have any with me, but in the valley there is a spring of the best water to be found in these parts." "What valley? How far away is it?" "Just a little way ahead. I'm taking these animals to graze there," explained Jean-Marie. "Good." The man alighted from his horse. "I'll walk along with you." Jean-Marie looked at him with interest. He was dressed in clothes made of cloth like that in the suit the mayor wore on very special occasions, and this man wore it to ride the dusty roads. The leather in the saddle he rode was soft and fine, so soft it barely creaked as he dismounted. How different from the leather the farmers used for their harnesses and saddles! The man led his horse, fitting his steps to those of Jean-Marie and the flock he drove. "I'm tired from hours in the saddle," he said. "Have you come far?" "From Paris." "This morning?" The man laughed, a loud booming roar which startled the sheep and sent them scattering. Jean-Marie had some trouble calming the skittish creatures, and started them on their way again. "I'm sorry, young shepherd, that my amusement caused you trouble, but I found the idea of riding here from Paris in one morning very funny. You are an ignorant peasant, aren't you?" "Yes," the boy agreed simply. He went on. "Is Paris so far, then?" "Yes, Paris is much more than one morning's ride, and I have come really much farther than that, for I have been in Italy with Napoleon Bonaparte's army." "And who is Napoleon Bonaparte?" The man paused for a moment, considering. "He is a Corsican, a young man who loves France and who has led the French army to victory in Italy, and he is the greatest general the world has ever seen." "Is he a good man?" "A good man? You are stupid. Didn't I just tell you that he is the greatest general that—" "My mother says that people use the brains the Lord gives them, and can't do more," returned Jean-Marie with dignity. "By 'good' I meant, does he say his prayers? Does he—" "I wouldn't know anything about that, although I would suppose that he has more sense." The horseman seemed angry at the mention of prayers. "Where is that spring you spoke of?" "Halfway down this hillside, sir. The water comes out pure and cool from between some rocks. Your horse can drink from the stream below, if you wish it." "Good. He must be dry too." They soon reached the spring. The man slaked his own thirst, and then led his horse the rest of the way down the little hill to the stream below. When the beast was satisfied, the stranger walked over to where Jean-Marie had seated himself on the grass. "How far is it from here to Iculi?" he asked. "I don't know in miles, but it takes my father several hours to go there in the wagon. My grandfather and aunt and uncle live there," the boy added. "Do you know what time it is? I want to get there before noon, and would like to take it slowly, if I can. My horse is tired, and we have far to go." "I don't know the time. My father and brother can tell time by the sun, but I cannot. We used to hear the Angelus ring, and then I knew the hour. But of course there are no church bells any more." "And quite right, too," the man growled. "You don't seem to know very much, do you?" "No, I don't know a great deal. I don't learn quickly, although I like to study, and would be glad." The man was not at all interested in Jean-Marie's desires. He mounted his horse and rode up the hill toward the lane along which they had come. "Does that general, Mr. Bonaparte, does he let the church bells ring?" Jean-Marie called after the horseman. Whether the man did not hear him, or whether he thought the question foolish, rode away without answering. The French village of Dardaly, in which the Vianneys lived, was far removed from Paris, but the actions in the capital pressed hard on all the people of France. It had been in July 1789, when Jean Marie was 3 years old, that the citizens of Paris stormed the Bastille, released the prisoners there, and seized the guns and ammunition stored within the walls. It was the beginning of the French Revolution. The country people decided that they would no longer pay taxes to the feudal lords who owned the villages, and to make sure of not being forced to do so, in many cases they burned down the castles where the lords lived, and drove them and their families away. Next they declared they would no longer pay tithes to the Church. Earlier the King of France, Louis XVI, fearing that trouble was coming, had made a few changes for the betterment of his people, but he had not made enough, and many times, having made a change, he was easily persuaded to swing back to the old ways again. Tired of this insecurity, the people took things into their own hands, and themselves made the changes they wanted. Some of these were good, but, as is often the case, the unwise and disorderly among the citizens came into power. They seized all the Church property. They declared that hereafter all bishops would be appointed by the State. Further, it was announced that all priests must take an oath to be loyal to the State first, the Church second. Most of the priests refused to do this. So in May 1792, the Assembly which then ruled France ordered that within the week all priests who did not take the oath must be driven from the country. Some left France. Some remained there in hiding, wandering about dressed as farmers or labourers, bringing the sacraments when and where they could. In September of the same year, kingship was abolished in France. The following January the king was executed. Before the end of 1793, France was at war with all the countries around her, and there was terrible poverty in the land. But to Jean-Marie Vianney all this was very far away. His world was in the field where the sheep grazed. He watched them until evening came, and then he started home, driving the flock before him. In the Vianney kitchen on this particular evening, the water in the great pot hanging on a crane over the blazing fire was boiling so fiercely that it forced the heavy pot lid into a clattering dance. Mrs. Vianney hurried to the fireplace, and seizing a pair of tongs, swung the crane a little away from the blaze. "The potatoes will all burst their jackets if they boil so fast," she commented. "Have you sprinkled the spice into the cabbage?" The question was not directed to anyone in particular, but her son Francus answered, "The cabbage is ready, mother." "Then put the bread on the table." The boy opened a cupboard and took out a large loaf of dark bread, big and round and weighing many pounds. "And the cheese, mother?" he asked. "Will there be enough for all?" He measured it with his eye. "Enough for 15 or 20, he reported. "It should do, unless Jean-Marie brings home a flock of children along with the sheep." "Jean-Marie knows that he should always bring in anyone who is hungry and has no one to turn to." There was a little sharpness in Mrs. Vianney's voice. "Ever since your father and I were married, it has been well known that food and lodging were given here free to any wayfarer. Jean-Marie is doing only what he always seen done." She sighed as she bustled about, placing all the eating utensils the house afforded on the table to be ready for whoever might come. These were dreadful days, when a strong and able man could not find work that he was willing to do, and when, much worse, church bells were silent and many churches destroyed. She whispered a prayer for the brave priests who, although they were hunted like animals, still contrived to live and do the duties for which they had been ordained. What had happened to her beloved France that it seemed determined to wipe out all that was good, to cultivate only evil? A stir in the yard outside the kitchen drew Francus to the window. "Father has 9 men with him," he reported, "and one of them, oh, mother, one of them is the poorest looking man that has ever come to be fed." "Then we must give him the place of honour," said his mother quickly. "Has Jean-Marie come back with the sheep yet?" "He is just driving them down the lane. The sheep and donkey are his only companions, except, of course," he added jokingly, "for his little statue of the Madonna that he always has with him." "He is a good boy, our Jean-Marie," said his mother fondly. "He is responsible and very trustworthy for a boy of 8, and devout too." "He knows his catechism well," said the older brother proudly. "I questioned him last night, and he was ready with almost every answer." The next few minutes were full of bustle and confusion. Some of the poor people who had come to be fed were abashed when they found themselves expected to eat indoors with the family. But in the poor unfortunates Mr. Vianney saw Christ, and he always insisted that they must be fed with the family. The great pot of potatoes was emptied into a wooden bowl, the spiced cabbage placed on the table, and after making the sign of the cross on its crust, Mrs. Vianney began slicing the loaf of bread. "The cheese," she whispered to Catherine, her oldest child. "There will be enough." There was little talk during the simple meal, but when potatoes and cabbage had filled the most aching cavities, some of the strangers tried out unaccustomed voices and talked with the children. Under cover of conversation at the far end of the table, the beggar on whom Frankels had commented spoke in low tone to Mrs. Vianney. "I have a message for you." Mrs. Vianney started and turned to face the man whom she had seated beside her. She found him intent on sopping up the good liquid from the cabbage with the crust of bread. "Is it something secret he wishes to tell me?" she said to herself. "What can he have to say that must be kept from the others?" She leaned over to pull the slab of cheese nearer to him, and with her lips close to his ear said, "Later, my husband will show those who wish to sleep here the way to the hayloft. You remain behind." The cabbage, the bread, the cheese were gone. Everyone was filled, and there was even a potato left. The 6 Vianney children knelt at a little shrine in the corner of the kitchen and said their night prayers. 2 of the strangers joined in, the others left. Already the faith was losing its hold in France. Prayers finished, the children went to bed. "You will not say the night?" asked Mr. Vianney of the man who still sat near his wife. "No, thank you, sir. I must push on." "Then I will show this friend where the hayloft is. You will excuse me?" His wife and the stranger smiled permission, and the father of the family left the house with the overnight guest. "It will be well if your husband can drive a load of hay to the farm of Mr. Dufour tomorrow," the stranger said. Mrs. Vianney's heart leaped up. "Mass?" she breathed. "Yes, in the loft of the barn." "Are you the priest?" "No," smiled the man. "I am just a messenger for Father Grabaz. The man in the barn is a friend, too, but we thought it best not to seem to know each other." "What terrible times!" The stranger smiled. "The Church was strong in the years when Christians fled to the catacombs," he said. "It is still strong. Now you must tell me to which farms hereabout I should bring the message." Together they went over the list. Mrs. Vianney sent him only to those families of whose fidelity she was perfectly sure. "There might be others who would like to go, but " "But we must be sure, Mrs. Vianney," said the guest. "We are staking our lives on each one we tell." "And the life of a good priest," said the woman solemnly. "What about the man in the barn?" she asked suddenly. "What will he do?" "He will ride on the load of hay. He is on his way to Ecouly, and it is reasonable that he should get a lift for part of the way." "What time should we leave?" "I don't know just how long it will take you to get there, but Mass must be finished and most of the wagons gone before daylight." "Won't the neighbours think it strange that so many loads of hay go to Mr. Dufour's, and then home again?" The stranger smiled. "Only half a dozen families will be notified of the Mass. You and your husband will come on the hayload, and perhaps one other couple will do the same thing. If either of the men has hay or produce for sale, he can go on into Ecouly. With each of the others I will make a different arrangement. All that is necessary is that we should have a few hay wagons backed up to the barn door, so that entrance would not be easy for any one who wished to interfere with the Mass." "You spoke of other couples. The children may not come?" "We cannot have the children. It would make the group dangerously large. And if there were trouble "I understand." Mrs. Vianney sighed deeply. "Catherine is a wise and sensible little person. I will tell her to take care of the smallest ones while I am gone. And my poor Jean Marie, he would so love to go to Mass. How am I to make Christians of my family when they cannot receive the sacraments, cannot go to Mass?" "I think you are doing your part very well," the man said smilingly. "As for the rest, it will come." He left the warm kitchen and went out into the cool April dusk. He and Mr. Vianney spent a long time talking together. Then, with the help of the other mendicant, they tossed hay from the bulging loft where it had been carefully stored into a wagon standing below. Somewhat after midnight the 2 Vianneys and their guests climbed onto the wagon and started out for the home of Mr. Dufour. They saw that the messenger had done his duty well. 1 load of hay was already there when they arrived, as well as a farm wagon with a load of poles up which runner beams would be trained. A donkey which had been ridden to the place was tethered near by. "I will give the hay to Mr. Dufour," Mr. Vianney told his wife. "Grazing will be good very soon, and we will not need it." "Does he need it?" asked Mrs. Vianney. "He will find use for it. The children may need new mattresses to sleep on, and it will be less conspicuous if we do not carry the great load home." The little gathering of people knelt on the wide planks of the hayloft, and by the moonlight which filtered in through a dusty window watched preparations being made for Mass. A manger carried in from the sheepfold, with a plank laid across the top, was to serve as an altar. A linen sheet, woven half a century before by Mrs. Dufour, was the altar cloth. Wax candles stood in treasured candlesticks, ready to be lighted when Mass began. Over in a shadowy corner of the loft there was a low murmur. "Father will hear confessions and give us communion," whispered Mrs. Dufour. Tears sprang to Mrs. Vianney's eyes. It was so long since this blessing had been given them. If only her little Jean Marie could be there, all the children! But for Jean Marie, somehow, it would seem especially right. When confessions were over, the Mass began. Mass celebrated by a priest whose frail body and sunken eyes told of the difficulties under which he had come to them. Just before the Pater Noster there were voices on the road which ran past the farm. Loud, unpleasant, drunken voices. Even if they don't actually hate Catholics, they would know we are fair game, and might decide to have what they call fun at our expense, thought Mrs. Vianney. She saw the men of the congregation exchange uneasy glances. "Et ne nos inducas in tentationem," and lead us not into temptation, said the priest, intent on the prayer. One of the worshippers arose and tiptoed to the window to see if the voices meant any trouble. Luckily the men were moving off, shouting and laughing foolishly. Even if they had known, these drunken, cursing rowdies would not have cared that inside the stable Christ had once again come down to lie in a manger. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Maria Therese. Of The Man Who Fought the Devil by Eva K. Betz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 2. Jean Marie was disappointed, very deeply so, when he learned that his parents had been to Mass without him. "I could have gone," he insisted. "I am almost a man, and I know all my prayers and catechism lessons." "But no children were there, no children at all," his mother explained. "Not even the Dufour children, and the Mass was said in their father's barn." "Well, I suppose I couldn't expect to go then, but I would have liked to," replied the boy with a sigh. In the days which followed, no one told Jean Marie that soon after the Italian fighting the whole French army was under Bonaparte's control. Prussia decided that she didn't care to continue the war any longer. Shortly after that, Spain followed her example. A little later, Austria, too, made peace with France. So France now remained at war only with England and Sardinia. The Vianney family lived much as they always had. Things cost more and there was less money to buy them. More beggars than ever came to be fed. More and more families whom they knew lost fathers or sons in Napoleon's army. But except for these things, the Vianneys were almost unaware of the mighty struggle for power which was going on in the world. The General Bonaparte, of whom the passing horseman had spoken to Jean Marie, was becoming a person of growing importance, was becoming more outspoken about his ambitions. "Do you suppose that I have gained my victories in Italy just to further the ambitions of the people ruling France?" he asked. "Do you think that my object is to establish a republic? Nonsense!" Napoleon Bonaparte was shrewd, and he was ruthless. He had the army largely with him because men liked to serve under a victorious leader, and Bonaparte had great skill as a military commander. While he climbed, step by step, into a position of power, he shrewdly changed some of the laws and regulations which were most irritating to the people of France. He did not believe, any more than the king had believed, that the people could rule themselves, but, when it did not interfere with his plan, he lessened some of the pressures which were making them unsettled. He did not return the church property that had been seized, nor did he at once change the laws which had sent most priests into hiding. But there was less open persecution of them. They were able to travel a little more openly, although they still had no parish churches in which to say Mass. So it came about that in the early spring of 1799 the Sisters of St. Charles arrived quietly in the little town of Eckeley to teach the children there. They could not have a parochial school, but they could at least live in a convent, and at regular intervals could gather the children into their home or the home of a neighbour to teach them something of their religion. Mr. and Mrs. Vianney talked over the situation. "Jean Marie knows the answers in his catechism," Mrs. Vianney said. "At least he knows all the answers we have." "All we have?" her husband asked. "What do you mean?" "The baby got the book and chewed up some of the pages," was her reply. Mr. Vianney shook his head sadly. "Not many," his wife added hastily, "and she didn't swallow them. But they are of no use, and I forget what was on them. But even if we had them, I would not feel able to prepare Jean Marie for his first communion." There was silence between them for a moment. Mr. Vianney watched the glowing embers in the kitchen fireplace as he thought the matter over. "I suppose it will be best to send the boy to stay with his uncle at Eckeley," he said at last, "though I will miss him. He is such a dependable boy, but his religion must come first." "I was hoping you would say that!" Mrs. Vianney exclaimed. "I will miss him too. But it would be wrong not to take advantage of the chance to have him properly instructed, and he will learn to write and to figure too." Not people to waste time once an action had been decided upon, the parents told the plan to the children when they wakened them at daybreak the following day. "Your father will drive into Eckeley this morning," explained Mrs. Vianney, "to discuss the matter with your uncle and with the Sisters." "Then I will go in to-morrow?" Jean Marie asked eagerly. "That remains to be seen," answered his mother. "To-day you and Frankels will take your pickaxes and loosen the earth in the far field where I plant the cabbages," instructed Mr. Vianney. When the two older boys worked together, Jean Marie was always disheartened because he never could keep up with Frankels. "But he is bigger and stronger," his mother would explain. "Not so much bigger," Jean Marie would protest. "If I tried a little harder, I think I could do as much." This particular morning he had a plan. The little statue of the Madonna had been given him some time before by a nun who was driven from Paris when all the convents had been closed during the Reign of Terror. She had found shelter for a while at her brother's home on a little farm near Dardaly. Her one treasure, the little statue, she had given to Jean Marie because of his great love for Our Lady. When Mr. Vianney left for Eckeley, Frankels and Jean Marie took their pickaxes and went out to break up the heavy clods of earth. As always, Jean Marie had his little statue with him. The two boys measured by the length of their tool handles the distance there should be between rows. Then they set to work swinging the pickaxes down into the hard earth, turning up the clods, and breaking them into fine particles. Jean Marie ran a few yards down the row he was working on, set his statue on the ground, and said, "Dear lady, help me to keep up with Frankels this far." When he reached the statue, he and Frankels were even. He set the statue a little farther on, and again asked for help. When the sun set, the field was ready, and Jean Marie had done a full half of the work. "Jean Marie kept up with me right through the day," Frankels reported. He seemed a little unsure whether to be proud of the younger boy or annoyed with him. Mrs. Vianney smiled. "He had a good ally," she commented. "Come, get yourselves washed, then look in the yard and the lane and see if there are any people waiting to be fed. With your father away, that is your charge, Frankels." "Oh, I hope the nuns are willing to teach me, and that my uncle takes me to stay with him," said Jean Marie longingly. "Whatever God decides is best for you is what will happen," said his mother. "Yes, I know that, but will uncle and the nuns understand what God says?" His mother was spared an attempt to answer that question by the entrance of Frankels leading 3 hungry men. The meal was hardly begun when they heard the sound of Mr. Vianney's wagon in the stable yard. He came into the house, greeted the family, and made the guests welcome, then sat down to eat. In spite of the fact that Jean Marie had spent a hard day working in the fields, his appetite suddenly left him. Had his father come home with a yes or a no? Other problems suddenly arose in his mind. Suppose the answer was yes? How would it be living away from his parents and sister and brothers? Would his aunt let him mold the clay statues and candlesticks, the making of which was his favorite recreation? The idea of leaving home to live in a strange place suddenly became a little frightening. Then he began to think of the nuns. He was not quick to learn, he knew. Would they be as patient as his mother and his big brother were? He would try his best, but would it be enough? Or would he make his mother's sister and her husband, Mr. and Mrs. Humbert, ashamed of him? His mind was in a turmoil, and his stomach very uneasy. By the time the meal was over, the poor people bedded down in the haymow, and the family gathered around the fire. "Well, Jean Marie, I won't keep you in suspense any longer," smiled his father. "Your uncle and aunt are delighted at the thought of having a boy in the house again, and the Sisters of St. Charles will gladly instruct you." Jean Marie drew a deep breath. He looked around at the family gathered in the kitchen. Eckerley was the best part of a day's walk, so he would not see them often while he was at school. And, somehow, he had never loved them so much as he did just then. "When will I go?" he asked in a rather small voice. "The day after tomorrow. I must put a patch on your shoe tonight, and I'm sure your mother will find things to be done before you are ready." "Indeed, yes. He can go barefoot tomorrow, while I wash both of his pairs of stockings. And Francois, let him wear your underclothes, so I can launder both of his sets. Jean Marie," she added, turning to the young would-be traveller, "give me your suit when you go to bed, so I can darn any thin spots, and make sure no buttons are loose." "I will get up early and make you a package of food to carry," offered Marguerite. "That won't be necessary," Mr. Vianney assured his daughter. "We will be there before noon." "Just think of it! Jean Marie will sleep here tonight, and tomorrow night and the next night he will be in Eckerley." None of the Vianney children had ever been out of their village of Dardalee. As far as they were concerned, the neighbouring town was at the end of the earth. They looked with great respect at the brother who not only was going so far away, but was going to remain there for a while. "Francois, run to the workshop and bring me a piece of leather," directed Mr. Vianney. "A piece about so big." He measured the size he wanted between his thumb and forefinger. "This shoe is cracked here, and will break right through if I don't stop it now." Francois sped to the workshop at one end of the barn. Mrs. Vianney got her sewing basket, lighted a candle on the kitchen table, and settled down to her mending. Jean Marie set to work waxing and polishing the shoe which didn't need mending. The other children tried to find jobs to do in this important family project, but succeeded only in confusing things. So all the young people were sent to bed, while Mr. and Mrs. Vianney worked to prepare Jean Marie to go out into the world. The next morning but one, Jean Marie's clothes were folded neatly and packed into a small box. The boy's mind was in a less orderly state than his wardrobe. He was afraid to leave home, even though he would not be with strangers. Yet he was burningly anxious to go to school and to prepare for his first communion. One emotion and then the other took possession of him until he was completely confused. Before he could sort out his thoughts, he and his father had arrived at Eckerley. He was settled in his uncle's home, and his father had left. Then began the difficult days. Jean Marie was a hard worker, a conscientious student who toiled ceaselessly to learn his assigned lessons. Learn them he did, but when he was called on to recite, his memory always failed him. He stammered and stuttered and lapsed into miserable silence. Despite this, the nuns sensed a quality in the boy which made them willing to give him special attention. He moved along with his class, and at last the great day came. June in 1799 had been unusually fine so far, but one particular morning seemed to outdo all that had gone before it. From before daylight, wagons and carriages had been leaving the farms around Eckerley, and though the people in the various vehicles pretended not to recognize or even see one another, they all seemed to be heading for the same place, the home of the neighbourhood nobleman, Count de Pignon. Quietly they tied their horses in the stable yard, and as quietly went in through the wide doors of the great house set among tall trees. A big room on the first floor had been arranged as a chapel. "See," whispered Mrs. Vianney to her husband, "the Countess has decorated the altar with flowers." Her husband nodded and ushered his children before him. Soon everyone was settled and waiting breathlessly for Mass to begin. At last the priest came into the room, and stood for a moment facing the congregation, but looking beyond them to the back of the chapel. "They come!" No one really said it, but at once all heads turned to look toward the door. 2 by 2, white veils on their heads and carrying lighted candles, the little girls of the First Communion class walked down the aisle between chairs and up to the seats near the altar. Then came the boys, faces shining, clothes well brushed, and wearing white ribbons on their arms. "Just as when we were children," whispered Mrs. Vianney. The veils, the ribbons, the candles. Not quite the same, pointed out her husband. Then it was a church. Now it is a parlour with curtains drawn. Their whispers stopped, and Mass began. When the services were over, the people arose to leave. It had been arranged that they wouldn't all leave at once. Such an outpouring would attract too much attention, rouse too much curiosity. "May we stay until the last?" Jean Marie whispered to his father. Even when the others were all well on the way to their homes, the boy still didn't want to go. He fingered the rosary which had been his first communion gift, and gazed lovingly at the little altar. The next day, at home with his own people in Dardaly, he was called early. "You are a man now, Jean Marie," said his father, "so you will do the work along with Frankels and me." So Jean Marie, though small for his 13 years, put on his work clothes and started sharing the heavy labour, while one of the younger boys took on the duty of caring for the sheep. End of Chapter 2. Recording by Maria Therese. Of the Man Who Fought the Devil by Eva K. Betz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 3. "Jean Marie, come and play quoits with us. We'll beat you this time, Jean Marie." "You never have, so why should you expect to this evening?" "Because. Come on, Jean Marie." The day of hoeing in the vineyard had been long and hot, and Jean Marie was very tired. But he did enjoy playing quoits with the other boys. It was the only game of skill he played, and he was very good at it. So good that he invariably won. "Wait until I put my tools away." It was the custom in Dardaly to play for stakes, a custom which Jean Marie didn't like. "Let's play just for the fun of it this evening," he suggested. "It's so long since I've played. I'm rusty. We'll call this a practice game for me." But his hopes for an unstaked game were not to be gratified. "No, no, here's my red top. I'll wager that. I have 2 sous my uncle gave me. Here is a knife. The blade is broken, but the half that's there cuts very well." As each boy laid his treasure on the little heap, Jean Marie's heart sank lower. The boys had few possessions, and he knew what the outcome of the game would be. But he started to play, and, as always, he did the best he could. It would not have occurred to him to play dishonestly, even though it would be playing to lose. One by one his competitors were beaten. He was the undisputed winner. Unhappily he walked homeward carrying the winnings he did not want. All during supper his mind was absorbed with the problem of how to get the things back to the boys. Simply to return them would, he felt, insult the former owners who had wagered them and lost. "But they can't refuse presents," he suddenly decided. "No one is so rude as to refuse a gift." Delighted with the idea, he could hardly wait for the evening meal to be finished. When he had done his part toward the cleaning up afterward, he ran to his mother. "I have some errands to do, Mother," he said, hoping she would not inquire what they were. "I'll be back very quickly, but I must go now." Mrs. Vianney opened her mouth as if to ask where he was going, but decided against the question, and simply said, "Run along." So Jean Marie ran first to one house, then the next. "I have a present for you, Thomas." "A present?" "Yes, I heard you needed a knife. I have 2, so I brought one to you. The blade is broken, but what is left cuts well." His eyes were cast down, so if there was a twinkle in them when he described the knife, it didn't show. "But that's not—" "This is a present, Thomas," said Jean Marie firmly. The boy was torn by conflicting desires. Politeness was esteemed in Dardaly, and politeness taught that one didn't refuse a gift, and he did want the knife. But he had no wish to be considered a poor loser either. Yet Jean Marie was insistent. "Well, all right," Thomas said gruffly, "if it's a present." "It's a present," Jean Marie assured him. And so one boy after another got back what he had lost. Much happier, Jean Marie ran home. "I like to play quoits," he thought, "but I must see if I can't get them to play without stakes. I really can't run around the village this way every night." By the following year, 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte was first consul of France. Austria had once more taken the field against him, but his army defeated the Austrian soldiers in several important engagements, and in 1801 Austria was glad to sign a peace treaty with Bonaparte. This man seemed to be blessed with great military genius combined with amazing luck. Other nations with which France had been warring followed the lead of Austria. From each, Napoleon collected tribute in the way of money or lands. In a few short years he had changed the map of Europe. Inside France itself conditions were bad. There had been waste and destruction during the Reign of Terror. There had been waste and extravagance in the years which followed. Now the country was almost bankrupt, and, what was worse, the people were so depressed that they did not seem to care. "Our roads are dilapidated, our harbours are filled with sand, so that ships are afraid to come into them with trade," Napoleon's counsellors told him. "We will rebuild the roads and clear the harbours," he replied. "Our industries are nearly dead. No one can afford to buy lace or linen or silk any longer. The government will set them on their feet. The government has no money. Few people pay their taxes, and what little income there is goes to the army." "Taxes will be collected from all who owe them," roared Napoleon. "The people are resentful and unhappy." "Free all priests from jail. That may please the people. And where churches still stand, let them be opened again." By 1800 a few of the priests who had been exiled had begun slipping back to their old parishes and taking up their duties, unofficially though more or less openly. In 1801 Napoleon signed an agreement with the Vatican returning some of the church lands which had been taken. He still claimed the right to appoint bishops, but at least the churches could be opened again. Father Grabos and Father Bailly were already established in Ecoli. As soon as it was safe, they began to paint and repair the church to get it ready for the parishioners once more. In 1802 Father Rey reopened the little church at Dardilly. Jean Marie was one of his first volunteer assistants. Jean Marie could read fairly well, and he loved to read the Bible. One day, working in the vineyards, he mentioned the miracle of Cana to some of the lads who were helping Mr. Vianney with the vines. "What's a miracle? Where is Cana?" Jean Marie was somewhat startled by the questions. He tried to explain, but found the boys uncomprehending and very soon uninterested. "Oh, if it's all about God, don't bother," said one. Jean Marie was aghast. "Don't you like to think about God?" "What's there to think about? I suppose there is a God, but—" "Stop! Don't talk that way." This was not the last time Jean Marie was distressed almost beyond endurance. As the days passed, he realized more and more that many of the boys knew little and cared less about their Creator. "If I only had some more schooling," he thought, "I could teach them. Some day I might even become a priest." He, a priest? He grunted, dismissing the idea. "There's no use thinking of anything like that. I'm a peasant farmer, and a farmer I must continue to be." The idea had come to his mind, however, and no matter how much he tried to argue it away, it would not leave. He read his Bible and the Imitation of Christ, and wished that he had more time for prayer. Then he reasoned out a solution. "When I'm working in the fields," he decided, "I can be working with God. I'll do the sowing and the weeding, but He will be blessing it. When it's hard, I'll offer up the blisters on my hands. When it's cold, I'll offer up my shivers." And so it went on for a few years. But at last, at 17, he could not stand the pressure of the great idea any longer. "I am sure God wants me to be a priest," he told Father Rey. "What should I do?" "You have had very little schooling," the priest said doubtfully. "You can read?" "Quite well, Father," Jean Marie answered happily. "And write?" "Not too well." There was less joy in his voice now. "Have you had Latin?" "No, Father." "No Latin at all? Nor Greek either, I suppose. Most boys who wish to study for the priesthood are well on in both languages by the time they are your age." Jean Marie's heart sank. Then he brightened up a bit. "Father, couldn't you teach me some of these things? I would work so hard." "I'm sure you would, Jean Marie." The priest smiled sadly. "But I'll tell you a secret. I may not be here much longer." At the desolate look on Jean Marie's face, the old man hurried on. "Oh, I'm not preparing to die, or not any more than we should always be preparing at any rate. But my years as a hunted priest have taken their toll of my strength. I am sick and unable to do the work which should be done in the parish, so I have asked to be relieved." Jean Marie left the house disheartened. He almost wept when he told his mother of his conversation with Father Rey. "I have often thought you had a vocation," said Mrs. Vianney, "but don't mention it to your father now. You would need more education before you could study for the priesthood, and an education would cost money. Just now your father is having a hard time raising money for your sister Catherine's dowry." So Jean Marie kept silent, hoping that after his sister's marriage his own chance would come. But when he did at last mention it to his father, Mr. Vianney would not hear of it. Jean Marie was too old, he argued. Jean Marie was a good farmer, a fine, steady workman. Couldn't he serve God and save his soul while working on the farm? And education was very expensive, and he had no money. However, he soon had to find some money for another purpose. Frankels was conscripted into the army, and his father had to find and pay a substitute to take his place, as was often done at that time. Another year went by. Daily Mr. Vianney beheld the pleading eyes of his son, and knew the special intention of his wife's prayers. Mr. Vianney gave in. "All right. You will have no peace, nor will I suppose, until you find out if you really have a vocation. We'll find the money somehow. But where will you go to study?" That was indeed a question. "I understand that Father Bailey has classes for boys at Eckeley," said Mrs. Vianney hesitantly. "Perhaps I can go in and talk with him." "I want to go with you, Mother. He must see what a big, clumsy lad I am before he commits himself." "Big, perhaps," smiled his mother, "but to the clumsy lout I can't agree." When Jean Marie and his mother reached Eckeley, they went at once to the rectory. Mrs. Vianney entered the house to talk to Father Bailey. Jean Marie waited outside in an agony of alternating hope and despair. Indoors, Mrs. Vianney suffered from the same emotions. "We need priests, yes," Father Bailey said kindly. "But your son, you say he is 19." "Yes, Father." "That in itself would be a difficulty. But when we add to the fact that he is late beginning specialized subjects, the further fact that little or no schooling has gone before, I don't see how it can be managed." "But he is such a good boy, and he wants so much to become a priest." "I know, and I am very sorry. But you see I have classes of boys who are already well advanced in Latin. I do not see how I could take him. He would not fit in anywhere." Mrs. Vianney twisted her handkerchief between her fingers unhappily. "I don't know how I can tell him. He has waited so long," she sighed deeply. "Father, may I ask a favour?" "Certainly." "Will you see Jean Marie, talk with him, tell him?" There was silence for a moment. "Yes, bring the boy in. I will try to make him understand and accept the situation. Perhaps I can suggest something." His mother opened the door and beckoned to Jean Marie, who came running. She watched as he came, with tears in her eyes. "He is so thin," she thought. "He has prayed so hard about this. I hope Father Bailey will be gentle in explaining." The boy, his thin arms much too long for the sleeves of the jacket which barely spanned his chest, was panting not from the running but from excitement. This was the moment he had wished for, worked for, prayed for, so long. Today he would take his first step toward the priesthood. "Shall I let him go in after all?" asked his mother. His mother wondered when she saw his eager face. "Shall I let him go in, or shall I tell him myself?" The decision was taken out of her hands by Jean Marie, who moved swiftly around her and into Father Bailey's little office. "You sent for me, Father?" Priest looked up, studying the eager, ascetic young face with its burning eyes. He started to speak, hesitated, studied the boy a moment longer. Then he smiled. "Yes, Jean Marie, I wanted to tell you that I will be glad to take you as a student." And so it was that Jean Marie went back to Eckeley to live and study. The months which followed would have discouraged completely any less determined person. At 19, Jean Marie was in a class of 11 and 12-year-olds, and even so was far from the brightest in the class; and the children, not meaning to be unkind, couldn't help but laugh when the man, as they called him, stuttered and stumbled over answers they could give with ease. "It's my memory, or rather my lack of it," Jean Marie would groan. "I know the lessons when I am studying them, but when it comes time to recite, the thoughts fly from my mind like birds from a cat. I just have no memory at all." He worked and prayed with equal intensity. There were moments when he lost all courage, but he always found it again. The people of Eckeley grew to love this quiet, intense lad who worked so determinedly to reach his goal. Then, in 1809, a new problem faced Jean Marie. Chapter 4 Recording by Maria Therese. War of the Man Who Fought the Devil by Eva K. Betz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 4. In 1806 Napoleon had decreed that young men studying for holy orders would be exempt from military duties. In 1807 and 1808 Father Bailey had sent Jean Marie's name as such a student, but in 1809 he forgot to do so. So, in early October of that year, Jean Marie was notified that on the 26th of that month he was to report at the military barrack at Lyons, the nearest large city, and begin his military service. Although that was the year Napoleon established the University of France, he was much less interested in educational work than he was in raising an immense army to keep his enemies in check. And for that war, unpopular with most of the people of France, he needed more and ever more men. "But students for the priesthood are exempt from service," protested Mrs. Vianney when she heard the news. "They are," Jean Marie agreed, "but for some reason my name was left off the list." "I'll hire a substitute for you," Mr. Vianney promised. Jean Marie expressed neither agreement nor disagreement with that plan. His father at once set about finding a young man who, for a sum of money, would serve in Jean Marie's place. "Any luck?" Mrs. Vianney would ask each day when her husband came home. "None. All the young men I can find have either served already or don't care to do so now." But one day he came home smiling happily. On a farm some distance from Dardailly he had found a boy willing to substitute for Jean Marie. The Vianney's household was happy again, and Jean Marie was deep in the studies which came so hard to him. But on the morning of the 25th, when Mrs. Vianney opened the kitchen door, she found a package and a note on the doorstep. The package was filled with coins. The note made her gasp. "What is it, Mother?" Catherine was worried by the shock on her mother's face. "What's all the money for? And what does the note say?" "The young man who was to substitute for Jean Marie," said Mrs. Vianney with a little sob. "He came during the night and returned the money your father paid him, because he has changed his mind and does not care to serve." "Changed his mind!" Catherine was aghast. "But he can't." "He has," her mother repeated. "Then that means that Jean Marie—" "Yes, it means that Jean Marie must stop his studies and serve in the army." The news depressed the whole family, and Mrs. Vianney was especially distressed when, toward evening, Jean Marie became sick with a burning fever. "You can't possibly go tomorrow," she said. "You should be in bed until this fever has left you." "I must go, Mother," her son said firmly. When Jean Marie arrived at Lyons, he was told that he would train at Bayonne. Before his detachment was ready to leave, however, he was in the hospital. He had always been eager to do any job assigned him, and now, even though he was in the army against his wishes, he fretted at the confinement and inactivity of the sick room. Out of bed by November 12th, he marched with his detachment, but he was still far from well, and when they stopped en route to Rouen, he was again thrust into the hospital suffering from a violent chill. However, the officer in command had been given a certain number of recruits to deliver at Bayonne, and when in early January he was told to take his unit on, Jean Marie, though not yet recovered, was ordered to leave the hospital and move with them. On the evening of January 5th, therefore, he crawled out of his bed, dressed, and started over to the captain's office to get his marching papers. On the way he passed a church and stopped in for a short visit. The church was cold and dark, lighted only by the little glow of the sanctuary lamp, and Jean Marie, as usual, was sad that so few people had stopped in to call at God's house. He said a few prayers of love and reparation for the coldness of others. He spoke of his longing for the priesthood, and asked for help in this strange life in which he now found himself. It was hard for him to tear himself away, but at last he did. He came out of the church quite unaware of the amount of time he had spent there. He hurried to the captain's office, and found it closed for the night. At first he was distressed, and could see no way out of his difficulties. He was supposed to march with his unit in the morning. He could not march without orders, and he could not get orders because the captain had left for the night. "I should have come here first," he berated himself. "Then when I had the papers I could have spent all the time I wanted to in church. I should have remembered that the office closes at 6 o'clock. Remembered? How could I when I have no memory, no brain at all, I sometimes think." After a few minutes of such turmoil, he settled down and tried to think of a way out of the dilemma. "Of course," he smiled. "Why am I so upset? I'll get up at dawn tomorrow, be there when the office opens, and have my papers by the time the unit is ready to move." He did get up at dawn, was there when the office opened, and got his papers promptly. But there was one thing wrong with his plan. His unit had marched an hour before sunrise. The captain was furious. "And so, Recruit Vianney, you feel that the army should be run to suit your convenience?" "No, indeed, sir." "You were told to come here last evening for your marching papers, I believe?" "Yes, sir." "Then why didn't you come?" "I did, sir, but the office was locked." "Why didn't you come earlier? Or did you think I should wait here until it pleased you to arrive?" "Oh, no, sir. I started early, but I stopped in the church on the way, and—" "In the church? What are you, an old woman preparing for her last end, or a man preparing to be a soldier of France? France will need help, surely, if this is the kind of recruits we get." Red faced with anger, the captain looked at Jean Marie's papers spread before him. "I see you have been in the hospital," he said. "You were supposed to have ridden on one of the wagons because the doctors thought you were not fit to march. Well, you'll march now and at double quick time." He scrawled a few lines on a sheet of paper. "Your unit has started for Bayonne on the Clermont-Ferrand road," he said. "You will set out immediately, follow, and overtake them. At the first long halt you will report to the sergeant in charge." Heavy-hearted, Jean Marie started off. He was still a recruit, had not been sworn into the army yet, so he had no uniform. But he did have his heavy regulation pack, which seemed to grow heavier each mile he covered. As a child driving his father's sheep or running errands for his mother, it had always been his custom to say the rosary as he walked along the road. He started now saying Hail Marys, begging for strength, for the ability to overtake his unit. The cold wind cut his face and made more difficult the breathing which was already painful because of his weakness and exertion. The strap of his heavy pack cut into his shoulder, and the road seemed full of round stones lying in wait to roll underfoot and twist the ankle of the hurrying recruit. He had had no breakfast. At first he had not minded this. When noon came, however, he realized that his weakness was not being helped by his fast. The sun passed overhead and was moving down the western sky. Lengthening shadows announced that the day was nearing its close. Jean Marie, each time he climbed a small hill, would anxiously scan the road as far ahead as he could see. A large group of marching men, accompanied by several wagons, would stir up an identifying cloud of dust, a cloud that the recruit hoped with all his might he would soon locate. Each time he had a hill to climb, therefore, the ascent was made a trifle easier by the hope in his heart. But each time he reached a crest and found nothing, disappointment became harder. A horseman approached, coming from the direction in which Jean Marie was going. The boy hailed him. "Have you seen a detachment of troops on the road?" he asked. "Yes, some time ago, about 2 hours perhaps. Why?" "I am supposed to overtake and join them." "On foot?" The man was unbelieving. "That wouldn't be possible. I've ridden 2 hours since I saw them, and they used the same 2 hours to march in the other direction." He looked with sympathy at the sick, tired boy. "Better give it up," he advised. "You'll never make it." The horseman cantered off about his business, and Jean Marie looked longingly after him. Then he settled his pack so it was less uncomfortable, and began slogging ahead. There was no hope of hurrying now. Just to keep going took all his strength of will and of body. Birds flew overhead, returning to their nests for the night. A man drove a yoke of oxen across the road, bringing them back to their barn after a day in the fields. Jean Marie was glad to be compelled to stop for a moment, as the lumbering animals went their way. When they had gone it was very still. The day was over, and man and beast were preparing to rest. A single star appeared, cold and far away, and at last Jean Marie accepted the obvious fact that he was not going to overtake his unit before they reached Bayonne. He finished another decade of his rosary, put the beads into his pocket, and looked about him for a place to spend the night. The rutted fields at either side of the road did not offer much in the way of shelter or comfort, but at the far corner of one of the fields an untouched stand of trees marked the beginning of a forest. Jean Marie decided to bed down there, rest his weary bones, and get a little sleep if he could. The fallen leaves of other seasons would make a satisfactory mattress. For a pillow he would use his pack. He knelt to begin his night prayers. "Hello! Who are you?" Jean Marie started. He had heard no one approaching, and he looked about to find the speaker. It was some moments before he distinguished a young fellow of about his own age standing among the trees. "Hello," he said. "I am Marie Vianney from Dartley. And what are you doing here?" "I am saying my prayers," answered the literal Jean Marie. "You came all the way from Dartley to say your prayers?" "Oh, no. I am here because I am a recruit in the army, and—" "The army?" The stranger looked about him uneasily. "Where is your unit? I thought you were alone." "I am alone." Jean Marie told his story to the stranger, who listened with interest. "Then you are not really anxious to serve in the army?" "No, I'm not," Jean Marie agreed. "But I was called up, and I have a duty." "Well, come along with me for tonight, anyway. I'll find a more comfortable place for us to sleep." Jean Marie rose. "Thank you, sir." "Call me Guy. Never mind the rest," he added hastily, as he saw Jean Marie about to ask his family name. Jean Marie stooped to pick up his pack, but when Guy saw the effort it required, he lifted it himself and swung it easily over his own broad shoulders. "This way," he said, and strode off through the woods. It seemed to the exhausted Jean Marie that he followed his guide for hours through dense forest, up hills, down steep declivities, through streams. He had about reached the limit of his strength, when they came to a clearing in the centre of which was a small house. Guy strode over and rapped on the heavy door. For some moments there was no response. Then, through a window, they could see a slight flare as of a lantern being lighted. The door opened a crack, and a man's voice asked, "Who is it?" "It is Guy. I want to talk with you." The door opened wider, and Jean Marie saw the householder lifting the lantern high so that its rays would fall on Guy's face. Over the man's shoulder was the frightened face of his wife, peering out to see who had disturbed them so late in the night. There was a long, low-toned conversation. Then Guy turned and spoke. "You can sleep here tonight, Jean Marie," he said. "And in the morning I will—" "We will see what happens in the morning," interrupted Guy gruffly. Thoroughly spent, young recruit Vianney slept heavily, so heavily that it was well after dawn before stir and movement in the house awakened him. When he realized where he was, remembered what had happened the day before, a wave of depression surged over him. He did not want to be in the army. He wanted to study for the priesthood. He had no affection for Napoleon Bonaparte, now self-crowned Emperor of France, no sympathy for the unjust war he was waging. But he had been summoned to serve in the army, and knew that his duty directed him to obey. He started out to do his duty, and through his own stupidity, as he saw it, had landed in an awful mess. He cringed at the thought of being brought to Bayonne in handcuffs, yet he was sure that would be the fate of a deserter, even an unintentional one. He had no appetite for the breakfast offered by the couple who had sheltered him, but he took it, feeling it would be ungracious to refuse. They asked about his home and family, and told him that they had been married the previous year. "I am a shoemaker by trade," said the man of the house, "but I am not doing so well because there are few people now who have the money to buy shoes." "We would be happy to have you stay with us," the wife put in shyly, "but we do not always have food enough for ourselves." "Stay here? I couldn't do that, anyway," said Jean Marie gloomily. "I must move on." "Yes, I would take you myself to the home of Mr. Fayot, our mayor," said the young host. "Must I go there?" Jean Marie saw himself paraded by the head of a local government, handcuffed, sent off in disgrace. "It will be best. Come, let's get started." Jean Marie thanked his hostess for her kindness, shouldered his pack, and followed his host through the forest. "The mayor does not live in the town of Nuez, where the town hall is, but in this settlement of Robins. Here is his house." Recruit Vianney remained in the yard, miserable and somewhat frightened, while his companion went in to talk to Mr. Fayot. It seemed a long wait, but before Jean Marie had finished the second decade of his rosary, the front door of the house opened, and a pleasant-faced, middle-aged man came out. "Well, Jean Marie," he said, "we have been planning how we can dispose of you." "Dispose of me?" quavered Jean Marie, with visions of scaffold and guillotine before his eyes. "Yes. I already have 2 young men living in my barn, and I think it would not be wise to have a third. But my cousin's widow, Claudine Fayot, will be happy to shelter you, I know." "But, sir, perhaps you don't understand. I am a recruit. I stupidly missed my unit. I am at this moment supposed to be in Bayonne." Too many young men are having their lives disrupted by a war which has gone on too long, which seems to us to have no justice in it," said Mr. Fayot firmly. "There are many men in these parts who do not feel bound to answer the self-crowned Emperor when he calls." "Do you think that is right?" Jean Marie was troubled because obedience to authority had been instilled in the Vianney children from the cradle. "Of course it is right. France needs young men at home, not dying in foreign lands in an unjust war." Mr. Fayot spoke very positively, and Jean Marie assured himself the mayor was the person in authority, a representative of the government. "If you think it is best for me to stay here," he began uncertainly. "I know it is best," said the mayor. End of Chapter 4. Recording by Maria Therese. Of The Man Who Fought the Devil by Eva K. Betz. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 5. Aside from the welcome he might have expected from his mother, Jean Marie would not have believed anyone would receive him with such kind warmth as Mrs. Fayot showed. Sick, bewildered, unhappy recruit Vianney was swept into the hearts of Claudine and her children. He was put to bed, cared for tenderly, nursed back to health again. As his strength returned, he took stock of his situation. Without ever intending it, he had become a deserter. He was an exile from his family, a man outside the law. Yet to give himself up now would be to risk the safety of all the people who had been so kind to him. And, too, he considered the fact that his call to the army was the result of an error on the part of Father Bailly. It would be best, he decided, to leave things as they were. He began a strange life, hiding in the barn most of the day, coming out only after dark had fallen. His emergence was always eagerly awaited, especially by the smaller Fayot children, for when he entered the house, story hour began. He told stories from the Old Testament and the New, the lives of the saints and legends about them. He read passages from the Bible each night, much to Mrs. Fayot's delight. Since her husband's death there had been no one in the house who could read. By March a more normal way of life was possible for Jean Marie. He took the name Jerome Vincent, and was introduced as a cousin of the Fayots, and with this new name and new identity he could go out in public once more. It was safe even to go to Mass on Sunday, a privilege for which he had been longing. The townspeople, completely unsympathetic with the Emperor's grandiose plans, did not inquire too closely when a new "cousin" appeared in the household of one of the neighbours, and if they noticed that the guests were all males and much of the same age, they never commented on the coincidence. Jerome Vincent soon established a little school in the Fayot home. At first it was meant only for the children of the household, but when the neighbours learned that the young Fayots were learning not only to read, but also something about their religion, for Jean Marie used the prayer book as a textbook, children from all the surrounding farms were sent to the classes. It was not long, in fact, before young and even older men began drifting into the school. The language Jean Marie used was simple. His own education had been sketchy, but he seemed to have something in him which reached out to his hearers. To each, whether child or man, the words seemed a message meant just for him. Through the month of March the classes continued. In April the snows melted, and the earth was ready for turning and seeding. Jean Marie had had enough of life indoors, and now that it was safe for him to be seen, he took up a spade and joined the men working in the fields. "Hello! The schoolmaster is joining us." Although by now he was very popular with the people of Robins, the men smiled at the thought of the frail-looking schoolmaster doing heavy work. But when he threw off his coat and began digging, the men saw that he was no novice at the job, and that experience made up for lack of brawn. And as he proved that he was able and willing to do his part in the manual labour of the place, the affection in which he was held became even stronger. His classes, moved to the evening hours now that preparation for crops filled the days, became larger and larger. Men came at first out of respect for the young man. They continued to come because of the information and the guidance he gave them. The people of the settlement of Robins and of the town of Noes were proud of Teacher Jerome, and determined that he should stay with them, that he should not waste his youth and perhaps his life in army service. Since the police were aware that the woods around Noes were full of deserters, they sent out search parties at intervals. The searchers were rather half-hearted in their efforts, did not exert themselves too much, but when they drew in their nets they usually had a few young men. In order that Jean Marie should not be included in any of these captures, self-appointed sentries along the various roads leading to the Fayot farm watched for searchers. When a group of police rode past, a child was sent flying across the fields with a warning. One hot day in July a red-faced, panting lad rushed to the fields where the Fayots were haying. "They come! The men looking for soldiers are coming!" "Run to the house, Jerome. You know where to hide," called Mrs. Fayot. "Not the house," warned her son. "The soldiers will see him as they come down the hill." "To the barn, then. You go with them, Jean," she said to her own son. "Take him up into the haymow and fork a good pile of hay over him." The two young men ran. Claudine kept the neighbour's child with her and thrust her son's hay fork into his hands. "Work," she directed. "Look busy." Jerome's fork she took herself and set to work with vigour. "Good day," called a voice from the road. "We are looking for deserters from the Emperor's army, and we are going to search your farm." "Search my farm? Why should you do that?" Mrs. Fayot tried to keep her voice steady. "We have told you." "But there is—" "We are searching your farm, madam. You and your son remain here." "I'm not—" The young messenger had been bewildered enough when pressed into work with the hay fork, but now that he was being counted as son in a family not his own, he started to protest. A sharp glance from Mrs. Fayot silenced him. "You are not what?" asked the soldier suspiciously. The little boy suddenly understood the situation. "I am not going to stay here in the sun," he said, pouting. "I am going to wait there in the shade of the hedgerow. If you do not object, that is." "All right. You both may go over there. It's farther from the house, anyway." The soldiers wheeled their horses and rode toward the farm buildings. The house was so small and so sparsely furnished that a few minutes' casual search satisfied them no one was concealed there. Then they went to the barn. "Who's there? What do you want?" Jean Fayot stepped out of the cool dark of the barn and shaded his eyes against the sun. "Police, looking for deserters." "Come right along, if you must. You won't mind if I keep on with my work. The handle of my hoe is broken, and I'm putting a rivet in it." "Go right ahead. You won't disturb us." Jean Fayot seated himself on the great grain chest and went calmly on with his task. The soldiers tramped around the barn, searching in dark corners and behind piles of lumber. "Try the haymow," directed the leader. Jean Fayot smiled a little and moved to seat himself more securely on the chest. One of the soldiers noticed the smile and spoke to the officer in charge. "Come down," he ordered the men who were climbing the ladder to the haymow. "Search that chest." They descended and walked over to Jean Fayot. "Get off there," they ordered. "There is nothing in here but grain," he said, continuing his work. "Off!" The order was sharp and angry. "You're wasting your time," said Jean Fayot. But as the determined men moved toward him, he slipped from his perch and stood watching. The police moved toward the grain bin, and one took hold of each end of the heavy lid which covered it. The officer in command and a companion stood back, ready to seize the man they expected to leap out and make a break for safety. The lid was thrown back. The chest was full of grain. "You see, I spoke the truth," said Jean Fayot, suppressing a smile. "Fortunately for you." The leader of the police was embarrassed and angry. "Come, we're wasting time here. We'll go to the forest and do our hunting there." The clatter of hoofs in the stable yard drowned out a mighty sneeze from the haymow above. Jean Fayot looked out of the barn door and saw that the police were now on the high road and hurrying away from the house. He quickly ascended the ladder and began tossing the great heap of hay to one side. "It's fortunate you held back that sneeze," he said. "If it had come a few minutes earlier, you'd be in irons now." "I know." The schoolmaster's face was uncovered, and he was wiggling to get his arms free. "I'd been fighting it for a long time." He was interrupted by another sneeze. "I never before realized just how dusty hay is, and I seem to have had some field mice for companions, too. Oh, I don't like this being an outlaw." Jean Fayot stopped his work. "You don't like living here?" "It's not that at all. Your mother is a second mother to me, and you are my brother. But it's such a disorderly, unnatural life I am living. I want to become a priest and teach the Word of God." "You are teaching," said Jean Fayot quietly. "The children hereabouts know their prayers and catechism, thanks to you. And many men who hadn't been to church in years now go regularly after hearing your teaching." "Yes, I know, and I'm grateful for that," agreed the schoolmaster. Months passed. By now the Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte ruled most of Europe. He had established a system of dependencies which included so much of the continent that it was possible to travel from the Baltic Sea to Naples and never leave land controlled by France. He wanted a son to inherit this vast power, and since his wife Josephine had none, he divorced her and married the Archduchess Marie Louise of Austria. By this marriage the adventurer from Corsica became allied to the oldest and proudest royal family of Europe. Napoleon ordered great celebrations all over his empire to mark his illegal marriage. There were fireworks and feasting, and as a gift to the people he ordered an amnesty, forgiveness for all the young men who had avoided service between the years of 1806 and 1810. So it was that, just after New Year's Day, 1811, Jean Marie Vianney returned to his parents' home. The people of Noailles and of the little settlement of Robins hated to see him go. All loved him, and many had come to depend on the wisdom of his advice. He always seems able to see what the listener needs to hear, they agreed, and when they at last realized that he was really leaving them, they determined that he must do them credit when he reappeared in his own home. There was real competition among them to see who could contribute most towards sending him back in style. A cloth merchant who had some good black material on hand offered that as his share, and the Noailles tailor gave his services in making it into a soutane. Jean Marie had to try it on and be viewed by all his friends. "But your shoes! They are old and cracked, and look very bad showing under your fine new soutane." The shoemaker got to work with donated leather, and made a sturdy pair of boots. "You will have your own parish soon," said Mrs. Fayot, "and you will need—" "But, Mother Fayot, I am a long way from being a priest yet, let alone having a parish." "You will be a priest," said Mrs. Fayot with assurance, "and your table must look well when important people come to dine. Here are a dozen linen napkins, my wedding napkins. I want you to take them." Little souvenirs, treasured for years, came from almost every home. One woman brought a bag with 3 gold coins. "But this is all the money you have in the world," protested Jean Marie. "I can't take this." "You'll need to buy books," the woman argued, "and I'll have more soon. I'm fattening a fine pig." Mrs. Vianney welcomed her son with joy almost too great to endure. His father, although happy to see him, was somewhat less enthusiastic. "You gave me a hard time running away and hiding as you did," he said sternly. "But I didn't run away. I've told you how it happened, Father." "Almost every day the recruiting officer was here. He would not believe. I did not know where you were," Mr. Vianney continued, paying no attention to Jean Marie's protest. "I was threatened with the loss of my home and all my property if I did not tell where you were." "But I was sick at first. I did not realize—" "You got well. Then you should have joined your regiment. You gave us all a very bad time." When he saw the distress on his son's face, Mr. Vianney relented a little. "It's all over now, anyway, and we are glad to have you back again." And he went on about his business. "Do you think I can continue my studies?" Jean Marie asked his mother when they were alone. "Oh, yes, you must." "But perhaps Father Bailey—" "Father Bailey expects you," his mother interrupted. "When we did not know where you were or what had become of you, I was so worried I was almost sick. So I went into Eckeley to talk with the good Father." Jean Marie waited eagerly. He listened patiently for a while, but then he became a little angry. "Angry? With you?" "Yes. He said I had no confidence. 'Go away,' he told me. 'I assure you that your son will be a priest.'" 2 weeks later Jean Marie was back at Eckeley. This time, instead of living with his cousins, he stayed at the priest's house, so that he could have constant help and direction in his studies. He was 25 now, and knew less Latin than many boys half his age, but he was more than ever determined to study and learn, to move ahead toward the priesthood. Day and night he tried to crowd the lessons into his mind, to master the Latin, which he must know if he was really to understand the lessons taught and recited in that language. For relaxation he worked in the rectory garden, alternately praying and reciting lessons to himself as he did so. "Vegetable seeds produce vegetables, vines produce grapes," he would mourn. "Everything does its duty except my stupid brain. I wonder if I will ever be able to learn all I must know." "Work, and don't be proud," counselled Father Bailey. "Proud? I certainly have nothing to be proud of," Jean Marie answered. The time was coming when he would have greater lessons in humility. After Jean Marie had been with Father Bailey about 6 months, the priest decided it was time for young Vianney to begin the year of philosophy, which he must take in the seminary. This was a foundation for the theological studies which would precede ordination. So Jean Marie was sent to the minor seminary at Verrieres, a sort of preparatory school for the major seminary of St. Irénée at Lyons. End of Chapter 5. Recording by Maria Therese. Of The Man Who Fought the Devil by Eva K. Betz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. Chapter 6. Although about 200 students were assembled at Verrieres, there were only 2 classes in philosophy. With a group of 100 to be taught, no pupil could receive individual attention. Learning had been hard enough for Jean Marie when Father Bailey could concentrate time and attention on him alone. Now he was almost frantic. He was sitting under a tree one day when a new student approached him. "Sir, I wonder if you could explain this to me," the boy requested. "I explain something?" Jean Marie was amazed. "Yes, Father. I don't quite understand." "But I am not an instructor, a priest. I am a student." "You a student?" It was the boy's turn to be surprised. "But you are a grown man." Jean Marie flushed and agreed. "I supposed you had a long service in the army," said the boy, finding this a natural excuse for the older student. "No, I was not in the army," replied Jean Marie. "Well, then, you must be very stupid," observed the arrogant youngster. "I believe I am," said Jean Marie humbly. This incident began a purgatory of teasing which Jean Marie was to endure from the heedless and the malicious among his classmates. On the other hand, others among the students realized that there was something rare and unusual about the young man who worked so hard against seemingly overwhelming odds. The teachers, too, found student Vianney so worth while that an exception was made in his case. Instead of requiring him to recite in Latin, which always threw him into a panic, they allowed him to give his answers in French. Some of the students rebelled. "Who is he that he should be given favours?" "A clumsy farm boy with no manners," others added. "A simpleton." But among the wiser ones, more than one said, "I'm sure he rates high in God's eyes." And before many months, even those students who had started out by making fun of their older classmate began to go to him for advice and encouragement in their problems. When they sought to consult him about some petty rivalry, some difficulty they were having, they always knew where to find him. He would be in the chapel, praying for help in his own problems. At the year's end, it seemed to him that he knew no more than he had on entering Verrieres. He was very homesick, completely discouraged, and more than a little tempted to give up the whole thing. "I could help my father on the farm," he would think. "He is growing old and could make good use of me. I'd work hard all day in field or vineyard, and in the evening I could teach religion to the children. That would be doing God's work." But then those thoughts would be swept away. "God has called me to be a priest. I am sure of it." And in spite of the fact that he, the oldest student in the class, was at the tail end of it, his philosophy teachers were sure of his vocation, too. They sent him on to the major seminary at Lyons. There again he had a chance to practice humility. While the more perceptive and spiritual among the seminarians appreciated the true worth of the backward student, there were others who saw him only as a stupid butt for rather cruel wit, a figure of fun or scorn. He was industrious. There never had been a better worker at St. Irénée. But in spite of that, and of the further fact that the teachers gave him private tuition outside his classes, he could not seem to accomplish anything. A subject which he grasped in the quiet of his study left his mind entirely when he was questioned in class. Nevertheless, the rector of the seminary allowed him to continue his work there. "We will wait and see how you do in the examinations," he said to Jean Marie. He too felt that there was something not at all ordinary in this young man, who worked so hard, who desired so fiercely to be a priest. Examination day came. For one of the few times in the history of the seminary, a candidate for the priesthood, received 0 as his mark. In December 1813 a heartbroken Jean Marie returned to Father Bailey to tell him of the disaster. "I will never become a priest now," he said sadly. "Of course you will," said Father Bailey sharply. "You have been called and you will serve. But it won't be easy." Easy it certainly was not. In fact, it required a high form of heroism to disregard the raised eyebrows of some of the people in Ecoli, to start in again trying to make his memory retain the lessons learned with such agonizing labor. The misery of those days would have been too great to endure if his ears had not rung with the echoes of Father Bailey's words, "Don't worry, you will be a priest one day." As the weeks passed, Father Bailey grew to love and respect his people more and more. France was desperately in need of priests, he knew, since so few boys had found vocations during the Reign of Terror and the years which followed. He could not believe that the heart of God would not be moved to help a young man so determined to reach the altar. So Father Bailey intensified his efforts. This time he taught in French, and before long he rejoiced to see that Jean Marie was getting a firm grasp on his lessons and retaining what he learned. When examination time came around again, Father Bailey went to Lyons with the request that his pupil be examined. "He is a most remarkable young man, and I am sure he has a true vocation. I have the feeling that as a priest he will do very good work." The Board of Examiners, made up of the best theologians in the diocese, agreed to let young Vianney try. "You must be very cool and calm," said Father Bailey when he returned to Jean Marie. "You know the answers to all the questions they might ask. Just think carefully and answer slowly. Don't get stage fright." But stage fright was exactly what Jean Marie did get. When he saw the stern-faced examiners, he went into complete panic. Their questions he either didn't answer at all, or answered so incoherently that he might better have kept silent. Father Bochard, chief of the examiners, was an old friend of Father Bailey. He tried to give the decision of the board as gently as he could. "We do not find the young man at all ready, or ready for our diocese, at any rate. Perhaps somewhere else he could pass an examination, or he might serve God in another way." "Father, please, no! He is a gem, this young Vianney, and we should make sure that he is a priest of this diocese. He was frightened today by all you grand people, and that is why he did so poorly." Father Bailey paused. "Perhaps you could come to Ecoli tomorrow, and if possible, bring the Vicar General with you. Examine Jean Marie there. You will see that he is ready." The two priests did go to Ecoli, and in the quiet of the house he loved so well, Jean Marie did much better. So much better that the Vicar General was convinced. "We will accept him," he decided. "We will work with him and do what we can. The grace of God must do the rest." On July 2nd, 1814, Jean Marie Vianney received minor orders at the cathedral in Lyons, and in August of the next year, in the chapel of the seminary at Grenoble, he was ordained. The physical act of getting to his ordination had required some of the same courage and persistence needed in preparing for it. Austria was once again at war with France, and the country Jean Marie covered on his 60-mile walk from Ecoli to Grenoble was infiltrated with enemy troops, likely to begin action at any time. But that difficulty seemed slight to Jean Marie when compared with those he had already overcome. After his ordination he made a 3-day retreat of thanksgiving, and then set out on the long walk back to Ecoli. There, to his great joy, he was to serve as assistant to his beloved cure, or, as we would say, pastor, Father Bailey. The people of Ecoli were as delighted to have Father Vianney with them as he was to be there. Father Bailey's joy was deep and very real. He was still a comparatively young man, but worn out by the hardships he had suffered during the Terror. He saw much to be done, and knew that his own strength was limited. But he was so familiar with the consuming zeal and dogged determination of his former pupil that he counted greatly on the help the 29-year-old priest would give him. Yet the very unworldliness of Father Vianney, which made him so excellent a priest, created problems for the cure. The younger man was so intent on the spiritual life and priestly work that he had no interest at all in the world of appearances. While never dirty, he was almost always a little dishevelled and shabby. At last Father Bailey could stand it no longer, He bought a complete new outfit for his curate: clerical frock coat, knee breeches, and fine black stockings. And shortly after he got them, Father Vianney had opportunity to wear them. "Mrs. Vincent wants to consult me about the education of her sons," Father Bailey said one morning. "I do not feel able to take the long walk, and anyway, your advice will be as good as mine. So will you walk up there today and see her?" "If you wish me to." "I do. And put on your new clothes. Spruce yourself up and do us credit. We don't want it said that the priests of Eckerley are Slovens," said the curé. Obediently Father Vianney dressed in his new outfit. He stopped in at the church to say a prayer that his advice might be good, and then went his way in the sunshiny morning. Mrs. Vincent lived more than a dozen miles outside Eckerley, merely a pleasant walk for the former country boy. The afternoon was nearing its close when Father Bailey glanced out of his study window and saw a bedraggled tramp nearing the house. He was about to hurry out to the kitchen to prepare food for the man, when a second glance showed him that it was no tramp, but his own assistant. He sat down with a thump, and waited for Father Vianney to come in. "Good afternoon, Father," the young man greeted his pastor. "I think we have solved Mrs. Vincent's problems." He paused, expecting to be questioned about the advice he had given, but there was silence of several minutes' duration. Then the curé spoke, spacing his words to give them weight. "Father Vianney, what happened to your good clothes?" Father Vianney looked down at his ragged breeches and smiled. "Oh, it was so fortunate," he said happily. "On the way home I met a beggar. He had lost everything, had no family, no home, and no hope. I talked to him of the love of God, and when he seemed to be encouraged a little, I exchanged suits with him, to help his confidence in Providence." There was another long silence. "You were on the way back from Mrs. Vincent's?" "Yes, Father." "Well, I can be grateful for that much anyway," said the pastor. The days and weeks and months went by. Father Bailey had long been noted as a preacher. Father Vianney was young and simple, with much to learn. But it was the masses and other services at which Father Vianney preached which were crowded with attentive people, hardly breathing for fear they would miss a word. People came from surrounding towns to hear him, because, they said, "He tells us what we need to hear." He had endless patience, especially with the children, spending hours with them teaching, explaining, and reteaching those who forgot. The children, as well as their parents, loved him dearly, and would have liked to include him in their simple social life, but he had no time for that. There were so many things to be done, and not enough hours in the day to do them. Then, too, the only intimates he wanted were Christ and his mother. The little boy who had always carried the statue of Mary with him was now the priest who always had her in his heart. Father Bailey was naturally delighted at the way his protégé had developed. Seeing that more and more parishioners were seeking out Father Vianney as confessor, he decided that he and the young priest should take up the study of theology again. In his early days as a student, we have seen, Jean Marie had studied and been instructed in Latin, and Latin was always hard for him. Now that the curé instructed and discussed in French, learning for Father Vianney was no longer a feat of memory, but an exercise in understanding and reasoning, and both priests were delighted at the progress made. These were happy days for the younger priest, and days of warm satisfaction for the older one, who knew now with certainty, if he had ever doubted it, that his efforts to see Jean Marie ordained were more than justified. The rectory housekeeper, Mrs. Bibast, knew that the curate's bed was seldom slept in. She suspected that he spent most nights kneeling in prayer or sleeping on the board floor. She knew the tiny amounts of food the two priests allowed themselves. She did not know, could not even suspect, their private mortifications and penances, but she did know, and the whole parish knew, that they had two very saintly priests directing them. It was toward the end of 1816 that Father Bailey became ill, and most of the parish work fell on Father Vianney's shoulders. He became more haggard and weary, and also more shabby. One of the parishioners gave him cloth for a new cassock, and another supplied money to pay the tailor. "When will you get your new cassock, Father?" he would be asked. "Oh, soon, very soon, but I haven't time to see about it now." Before he found the time to see about it, and the tailor could set to work, Father Vianney had a visitor, a woman who came of a wealthy family, but who had lost her fortune, as well as her husband, during the wars. Sick and almost desperate, she came to the priest for advice. He talked with her a long time and sent her away comforted. He felt, however, that he himself should do more. He hurried to the tailor's house to ask for the money deposited to pay for the making of his cassock. The tailor was not at home, and his wife was most unenthusiastic about their losing the job. She thought up all sorts of excuses for not relinquishing the money, but in the face of Father Vianney's persistence, she at last gave in. That night Father Vianney secretly stole to the home of the woman who had called on him, and left the money where she would find it in the morning. Before another attempt could be made to get the cassock finished, Father Bailey's illness took a mortal turn. The people of Eckeley were grieved by the death of the good old priest who had served them so long and so well, but they found their grief lightened because Father Vianney was still with them. That he would be appointed curate no one doubted. Even when young Father Trippier was sent to replace Father Bailey, the people, though surprised, were not deeply disturbed. They still had Father Vianney. Then in February of 1818, word was sent to Jean Marie that he was to report to the office of the Vicar General of the diocese. He was startled at what he was told there. "About 20 miles from here," said Father Corban, the Vicar General, "is the little parish of Ars. There is a chapel there without a pastor. The curé recently died. The people, I am afraid, are mostly a worldly and godless lot, with little interest in religion." The Vicar General paused for a moment and studied the face of the priest before him, looking for signs of disappointment or displeasure. Father Vianney, he knew, had grown up largely in Eckeley. He had studied there, worked there, been happy and successful there. It would be quite natural to have at least a little regret about leaving it, especially since he would be going to a smaller, poorer, more indifferent parish. But no smallest sign of unhappiness appeared on Father Vianney's face. "How do I get there?" he asked. "Ars is remote," Father Corban said. "It can be reached only by a narrow little road, but a cart can get through if you want to borrow one to carry your goods." "How soon do you want me to be there, Father?" "Within 2 weeks, if you can manage it." The Vicar General paused. "I seem to remember that you were determined to become a priest in spite of odds against you, that you wanted to do God's work and teach His word." "That is right, Father." "Well, I must tell you this. When the Reign of Terror came, and priests and sacraments disappeared, their disappearance from Ars was permanent. The people there are cold and unfriendly, most of them. They feel that religion would interfere with their pagan way of life, so they keep religion out. A few will welcome you as a curé, but very few. On the whole, you will find that your presence is resented, your work ignored or hampered. They certainly need a priest, the people of Ars. God bless you and give you strength for your work there. You'll need it." End of Chapter 6. Recording by Maria Therese.